So my topic this evening is quite a specific one, but obviously it touches on a number of other related issues, and I'm sure we will cover those issues in discussion after my remarks. But my remarks are specifically about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, a dangerous comparison. And Charles stole my first line, so thank you, Charles, very much, because I was going to say that the time was when anti-Semitism in Britain was the prejudice that dare not speak its name. You could talk about all kinds of other prejudices, but as soon as you mentioned the word anti-Semitism, as Charles said, people started looking at their shoes. It was considered very infra-dig, and the reasons for that are important, and I will come on to those in a moment. But nevertheless, that was the case. It was a taboo word, and I couldn't use it without fear of even worse consequences for myself in terms of my professional reputation happening than were already occurring. And so imagine my amazement when, as of very recently, I would say in the last few weeks, the word anti-Semitism has been bandied around in British newspapers. Imagine my shock. I would never have believed it possible to have seen this word being reproduced without, you know, a health warning or a trigger alert, I think you call them in this country. There has been an absolute outbreak of real concern about outbreaks of anti-Semitism, so-called, among Labour Party members of Parliament. Now, you may be aware that the Labour Party in Britain has, a year or so ago, elected as leader a man called Jeremy Corbyn, who is on the extreme left and who is known to have shared platforms and found nothing wrong in people from Hamas and the Hezbollah and stuff like that, and people who have made very bigoted remarks about Jews without even bothering to couch it in terms of Israel. And there are many members of Parliament, Labour members of Parliament, who are very concerned about this. It's come as a terrible shock to them that a number of these members of Parliament have been caught out, and it's being reported of what they have said. In addition, the chairman of the Oxford University Labour Club, not a Jew, resigned in protest at what he said was totally dreadful attitudes against Jews in the Oxford University Labour Club, which is affiliated to the Labour Party, and more generally on the left in Oxford. And he said it's anti-Jew and it's connected to Israel. And the balloon went up. For the first time, it was being reported that there was concern about anti-Semitism on campus, not anti-Israelism, anti-Semitism. And this produced a number of reactions which were in some ways heartening and in some ways disheartening and indeed quite comical, because a number of Labour members of Parliament and a number of commentators said, made speeches and wrote articles saying this is appalling. Where has this come from? What a surprise. Not to me, but anyway, what a surprise to them. They couldn't understand where it had come from because prejudice against Jews is, you know, not on. And it's connected to Israel. Imagine my amazement. They are connecting prejudice against Jews with prejudice against Israel. My goodness me. However, joy was not unconfined because a number of these people went on to say, we have to stamp this out. We cannot have a Labour Party which is tolerating this kind of bigotry. It is bigotry. It has to be exterminated and etc. Fine. They then went on to say, but that doesn't mean we should stop saying that Israel is a vicious, dreadful state and it oppresses the Palestinians and it's the cause of war in the Middle East and Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal, without understanding that if you tell lies about Israel, then it's a form of Jew hatred and leads inescapably, in my view, to Jew hatred that doesn't even shelter behind the anti-Israel thing. So they don't get it. But nevertheless, it's on the agenda. And the other thing that some of these commentators have been saying, and politicians, is we have to defeat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. In other words, there is an equation. Yes, we are very concerned about prejudice against Jews, but we are equal opportunity anti-discriminators, and we must balance that concern for eradicating prejudice against Jews with our equal concern for the equal evil of Islamophobia or prejudice against Muslims. So, in my view, this equation, this equality, this identicality is very wrong. This idea these are twin evils to be defeated, that Jews and Muslims equally have to be defended, that there is an equality or an identicality of victimhood on both sides. Now, I think this is very wrong on many counts. And in order to get into why it's wrong, I think we have to understand why anti-Semitism, the word anti-Semitism, was unsayable in Britain for so long. The cardinal premise of progressive opinion in Britain is what's called equality. But by that, what is meant is really what I would call identicality. That is to say, you have an absolute belief that there is an absolute equality in terms, or identicality in terms of lifestyle, culture, and victimhood. So you can't say that one culture is better than any other, regardless of what people are doing. You can't say that one lifestyle is better than any other, regardless of what people are doing in that lifestyle. And you can't say that anyone who claims they are a victim is anything other than that thing. They are victims equally, and all victims are equal, and they're all equally victims of something or another, except for anti-Semitism. The Jews were not victims. The Jews were not victims. Why was that? Well, partly because it was the link with Israel. You say this is anti-Semitism, I say you are sanitizing Israel's misdeeds by waving the shroud of the Holocaust. This was the standard response. When anyone said there is a problem with the treatment of Israel, it is uniquely, it is a unique treatment and it is a form of Jew hatred, the answer was you are waving the shroud of the Holocaust to sanitize the crimes of Israel. So anti-Semitism was unsayable partly because of the Israel thing, but that wasn't all. I think that anti-Semitism was unsayable for two other reasons. First of all, Jews are not considered a minority. Now, this is a little bit silly, to put it mildly. There are 60 to 65 million people in Britain. There are 280,000 identifying Jews, but they're not a minority because, as we all know, the Jews control everything, don't they, in the West. They control finance, they control the media, they control the law, they're everywhere. So they're not a minority. Because the dominant narrative is that to be a minority or to be a victim, it's not enough to be numerically a minority. That doesn't count anymore. You have to have no power. And Jews have power. We can all see it. They have power. They run the West. They run America. They run the West. So Jews are not a minority, so they can't be victims, because only minorities can be victims. The majority can never be victims. The minority is always the victim of the majority, so the majority can never be a victim. So I have to tell you, apropos of 9/11, when 9/11 happened, a very common reaction in America, in Britain, was America had it coming to it. It couldn't be a victim. Could not be a victim, because as we all know, America runs the world, grinds the faces of the third world into the dust, and consequently America couldn't be a victim. That's how it was seen. So Jews can't be victims. And then there was a final reason why anti-Semitism was not considered to be a kind of victimhood, which is my theory. It's not just my theory, but it's not possible to prove it, but I feel it to be the case. I would call it Holocaust revenge. As you know, it's a bit of a joke. Some people use it as a joke, but in my view, it's not a joke. It's absolutely correct. The Jews will never stop being blamed for the Holocaust, because to the Europeans, they can't deal with their complicity in what happened. And I'm not just talking about the Germans, I'm talking about the Europeans generally turning a blind eye, etc., etc. They can't deal with this. The enormity of the crime to which they were at least partly responsible is such that they can't bear the idea anymore that Jews can be victims. Jews can never again be considered victims, because that brings up their complicity in when they were victims of the Holocaust. So in order to kind of mask that or get over the pain of that, Jews can't be victims. Then they're free of that guilt. And so it's very convenient that Jews have become in Britain, or became, certainly with Ariel Sharon. I remember this happening in 1982 when Israel was having its very controversial adventure in the Lebanon, and there was the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, you may recall, conducted by the Christian phalangists, but with Israel apparently giving a nod and a wink. At least that was what was thought to have happened. So Britain was thrilled. Britain now had a Jewish Nazi. And that gave Britain and Europe the get out from the Holocaust. Because if the Jews were turning into Nazis, then the Nazis weren't really that bad, because the Jews were doing the same kind of thing. And therefore, their own complicity, Europe, Britain, the West, in what happened was much lessened. So that's my theory. Anyway, for these reasons, anti-Semitism was unsayable. But I also think there's another reason, and this is where it links directly to the Israel, the Middle East. To say that Jews are the victims of Jew hatred goes against the narrative. Now, for the liberal or left progressive position, there is one narrative, only ever one narrative on any issue, and it cannot be gainsaid. It's an orthodoxy. Whatever it is, it's an orthodoxy, and that's it. So the narrative is that in the Middle East, the Palestinians are victims. They have to be victims. Why? They're the third world. The third world are axiomatically victims, and they are people whose own story is that they were driven out. And as far as the British are concerned, they have no idea whether that was true or not, but they believe it on face value. And they also believe on face value the idea that the Palestinian Muslims were in Israel since time immemorial. That Palestine was Palestine since time immemorial, probably since Adam, and that the indigenous people of current Israel were the Palestinian Muslims, and that the European Jews who had no connection whatsoever with the land of Palestine were parachuted in as a result of Holocaust guilt into Palestine, where they proceeded to displace the indigenous people, the Palestinian Muslims, into dreadful refugee camps where they still are, brackets, refugee camps after all this time, but anyway, then you think about that, and where they're trying to basically make their lives complete misery until this very day. So that's the sort of prevailing narrative. The Palestinians are Muslims. So therefore, you cannot have Jewish victims. The Palestinians are victims. You cannot have Jewish victims. You cannot have Israelis who are victims, because the Israelis are the people who are victimizing the Palestinians. So when the rockets come from Gaza, and when, as is happening at the moment, almost every day, Israelis are being stabbed and rock thrown through their windshields, and generally murder is being attempted and often is succeeding against them, it's not even reported. It's not even reported in Britain. No one knows this is going on. No one. Because they're not victims. They can't be victims. You cannot have the victims who are the people who are oppressing the victims. It does their head in. So the Jews are not victims. So because the Jews cannot be victims, and because the Palestinians cannot be victimizers, and because Muslims can't be victimizers, because Muslims are a minority and they are the victims of the Christian West, therefore Palestinian and Muslim anti-Semitism is just denied. No one knows about it, no one writes about it, no one talks about it, and if you were to mention it, you would get accused of Islamophobia. So this is quite remarkable, because Palestinian violence against Israel is being driven at the moment by classic, clear, religious Jew hatred. Mahmoud Abbas says, "Get off the Temple Mount with your filthy feet," not reported in Britain, but that's what people are being told. That's what the Palestinians are telling their children. They are telling their children Al-Aqsa is being attacked, and this is all part of the Jewish conspiracy to destroy Islam. We're under attack by the Jews. You must kill Jews. Your highest calling is to kill Jews. None of this is reported at all in Britain. And it's very, very clear. I mean, there are innumerable examples. I get many of them from Palestinian Media Watch, which is an excellent resource. I do commend it to you. For example, a Palestinian Authority TV host of a program teaching Islam explained in a recent TV interview that the US and Israel share the goal of destroying the morals and values of the Arab world and are trying to do this by spreading pornography and sex. That's just one of many, many examples. According to Palestinian Media Watch, the Palestinian Authority, that well-known source of moderation and statesmanship, which Britain and Europe hope will eventually become a Palestinian state because it's worthy of being given its own state. The Palestinian Authority presents Jews as possessing inherently evil traits. Jews are said to be treacherous, corrupt, allied with the devil, descendants of apes and pigs. In 2015, Mahmoud Abbas's advisor on Islam and the head of the Palestinian Authority Sharia courts taught on Palestinian Authority TV that Jews throughout history have represented falsehood, evil, the devils and their supporters, the Satans and their supporters. Accordingly, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, in the view of this gentleman, was a conflict of Allah's project versus Satan's project. Amazing to report, nothing about the settlements. It's Allah versus Satan, and Satan is the Jews. A more classic example of anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, cannot be imagined. The official PA Daily published an op-ed saying Jews are thirsty for blood to please their God against the Gentiles and crave pockets full of money. These Jewish attributes and traditions are presented as the unchangeable nature of Jews. The PA regularly claims that the Jews were forced out of Europe in the past because of the threat that their evil nature posed to the Europeans. These Jewish traits and ways of behavior constitute a danger, it says, not only to all Muslims and Arabs, but to all of humanity. That's the Palestinian Authority. In the wider Arab and Muslim world, Jew hatred simply pours out and has poured out for years, and is not even sanitized by any reference to Israel. It's Mein Kampf, it's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it's Jews baking the blood of Gentiles and Palestinian babies in their matzahs. It's all of that. It's the same motifs, the same lies and libels, the same absurd conspiracy theories that go back centuries. It's unequivocal Jew hatred, and it's pouring out all the time. Now, what people do not understand at all, because this is never reported, it's never mentioned, it's never discussed, is the centrality of Muslim anti-Semitism, not just to the campaign against Israel, but to the campaign against the West. In 1998, Osama bin Laden said, "The enmity between us and the Jews goes back far in time and is deep-rooted. There is no question that war between us is inevitable. The hour of resurrection shall not come before Muslims fight Jews." He's talking not just about Israel, he's talking about Jews in general. "We promise our Muslim brothers that we will do the best we can to harm Jews in Israel and the world over with Allah's help and according to his command," said Al-Qaeda's number 2 Ayman Zawahiri in 2008. Sheikh Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has said, quote, "If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. Notice, I do not say the Israeli. That's what the leader of the Hezbollah said. An Egyptian cleric, Mohammed Hussein Yaqub, said on Al-Rahma TV in January 2009, the real reason for the Muslim war against the Jews was nothing to do with Israel. Quote, if the Jews left Palestine to us, would we start loving them? Of course not. We will never love them. Absolutely not. The Jews are infidels, not because I say so, and not because they are killing Muslims. It is Allah who said that they are infidels. Your belief regarding the Jews should be first that they are infidels and second that they are enemies. They are enemies not because they occupied Palestine. They would have been enemies even if they did not occupy a thing. Now, there are innumerable references in the Quran and the Hadith to the enmity of Islam against the Jews. I won't bore you with all the references, but there are many of them. Now, the point is this, that it's not simply the Jews as Jews, and it's not simply the Jews of Israel. It's the idea that the Jews stand behind the West. The Jews stand behind modernity. The fight that Islam has with the West is a defensive fight, actually. It's a defensive fight against modernity, which it perceives correctly is about to destroy Islam. In large measure, I think, because of the appeal of to women of modernity. But anyway, it sees modernity as the threat, and the Jews are behind modernity. You can see that from the Hamas Charter, which, apart from its stuff about getting rid of Israel, quite comically, if it wasn't so awful, says the Jews are behind the whole of modernity. From the French Revolution onwards. They were behind the French Revolution, they were behind the Industrial Revolution, they were behind the development of sociology, they were behind the development of capitalism, they were behind the development of communism, they were behind the League of Nations, they're behind the First World War, on and on it goes. Every aspect of the modern world is put down to the Jews, because the Jews control America, America controls modernity. And this was also found within the writings and thinking of the man who could, well, one of the few men who can legitimately be called the founders of modern Islamism, Sayyid Qutb. He founded what became the Muslim Brotherhood, an Egyptian cleric, and he wrote a diatribe in 1950 called Our Struggle with the Jews. And he declared that the Jews were the adversary of God. Quote, the Jews were the enemies of the Muslim community from the first day. He said the Jews were conspiring to penetrate governments all over the world to perpetuate their evil designs, including a plan to take control of all the wealth of mankind. One of the tricks they were playing on the world was the development of philosophy, whose purpose was to eliminate all limitations imposed by faith and religion, so the Jews could penetrate the body politic of the entire world. At the top of the list of these activities was usury, the aim of which was that the wealth of the whole of mankind should end up in the hands of Jewish financial institutions. Now, he was the inspiration of the Muslim Brotherhood. Radical Islamists follow what he said and thought that this is mainstream radical Muslim thinking. Now, the writer Matthias Kuntzel has noted that to Qutb, not only was everything Jewish evil, but everything evil was Jewish, particularly sensuality. So Qutb wrote, alluding to Marx, Freud, and Emil Durkheim, Qutb wrote, behind the doctrine of atheistic materialism was a Jew, behind the doctrine of animalistic sexuality was a Jew, and behind the destruction of the family and the shattering of the sacred relationship in society was a Jew. They free the sensual desires from their restraints. They destroy the moral foundation on which the pure creed rests, in order that the creed should fall into the filth which they spread so widely on this earth. And it's stuff like that which is behind the Hamas covenant. It's not simply what Hamas thinks. This drives the Muslim world, that the Jews are behind modernity, the spreading of evil in the world, which is spread by America in particular, because America controls capitalism, modernity, runs the world. So America is the principal target, but the people who run America are the real target. And for all these and other reasons, you will have noticed that in these terrible atrocities that happen so regularly in Europe, for sure it's against a lot of people. It's against infidels generally. But within those atrocities, there's always a particular targeting of Jewish institutions and of Jews, because Jews have a central place in this demonology against the Western world in general. Now, none of this, absolutely none of this, is known, I think, to more than a handful of people in Britain who are all, obsessive like me and driven by a particular, noxious ideology. It's never mentioned. It's never reported. Nobody has a clue that Muslims generally think like this. And in fact, there have been people who've actually blurted out this truth within the Muslim community in Britain. There's one particular individual who he tries to conceal his radical sympathies, and who said once, "It's our dirty little secret that Jew hatred is absolutely omnipresent in the British Muslim community." Now, this was not reported. I mean, I read it, but it was only reported, on a blog, or picked up by particular people, but it wasn't widely reported. It's simply not noticed. Nobody has a clue about any of this. Not only is it ignored, but you have, instead of the discussion of Muslim anti-Semitism, you have instead the discussion of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is the problem, the social problem, the evil of bigotry that we all must address. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that prejudice or bigotry against anybody is wrong, and there is no doubt, I'm sure, that there are people who really dislike Muslims. They dislike people with brown or black faces. They dislike people of all kinds, because there are people who are bigots. But the claim of Islamophobia has a characteristic which is simply not acknowledged. The difference between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is the difference between truth and lies. Anti-Semitism is a true prejudice because anti-Semitism rests entirely upon lies and libels about the Jewish people. So whatever form these lies and libels take, they are untrue. Islamophobia, on the other hand, is a false prejudice designed to shut down the telling of truths about Muslims or Islam. Because if you tell the truth that there is a problem within the Islamic world, there is a problem within Muslim culture to do with extremism, there are problems to do with Islamic theology and history with which Muslims themselves have to deal, any kind of criticism of Islam or Muslims which is based on evidence and fact and truth is said to be Islamophobic. Any criticism is said to be Islamophobic because no criticism can be tolerated of Islam or Muslims. So Islamophobia is the accusation which shuts down legitimate debate, not just about Muslim anti-Semitism, but about all the problems to do with the Islamic world, which we need to know and we need to discuss, and the Islamic world needs to discuss them as well and do something about them. But we're not allowed to say that, because if you're saying it, you are considered to be and said to be Islamophobic. And this is in Britain, I don't know about in America, but in Britain this is a deadly accusation. It's equivalent to racism. It's equivalent to anti-Semitism. It means you are a really bad person. You are a bigot, you are prejudiced. But you cannot be, in my view, prejudiced or bigoted if you're telling the truth. And it's this inability to understand or acknowledge the difference between truth and lies which is really poisoning public debate about these matters, and I would say also about Israel. Equating Islamophobia and anti-Semitism strengthens the weapon of Islamophobia and weakens the fight against anti-Semitism. But I also think this doesn't just hurt Jews, it damages the defense of the West for the reasons I have already alluded to, that Muslim anti-Semitism drives the hatred of the West and the desire to bring it down. Jihadists are motivated in large measure by Jew hatred. They're motivated by hatred of the infidel generally, it's true. They have bad designs against Christians and people of no religion, that's true. But what drives them, what gives them the hysteria, the obsessional hysteria, is the Jew hatred. Because Jew hatred is behind their hatred of modernity. But in Britain and Europe, and I think here as well, people are just not joining up the dots. They try to deny the Islamist nature of Islamist terror by finding any reason to say it's nothing to do with Islam and somehow it's all the fault of the West instead. The attacks on Jews, both in the diaspora and in Israel, is of course one of the biggest clues that it cannot be the fault of the West. That there is something else going on here. It is hatred of Jews which is driving the attacks on Jews, which is why the attacks on Jews are so inconvenient, because they get in the way of the narrative. The narrative is, we all know, the reason why there's no peace in the world is the Israeli settlements. This theory is taking a bit of a bashing at the moment when the television news is full of Syria and Islamic State. But anyway, you get the general idea. The atrocities that we have seen in the last few months and recent years, unfortunately, they don't actually bring people to a more realistic understanding or analysis of what's happening. For sure, they shock everybody. But if you look at the massacres in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, the attack on the magazine Charlie Hebdo because it published cartoons which were insulting to Muhammad and to Islam. And the same day there was the attack on the Hyper Caché kosher supermarket and the attempted attack on the Jewish school. Now, the massacre at Charlie Hebdo gave rise to claims that Charlie Hebdo was responsible for the attack. If it hadn't published because it published these cartoons, said CNN and many commentators, both in Britain and here, because it published those cartoons, it was asking for it. It knew that what was going to happen. So, it knew that it was going to be open to people trying to murder everybody in the magazine, and yet it went ahead and published a cartoon, so it's its fault. So, thank goodness, we can actually ignore the fact that it was Islamists that did it, or Muslim fanatics. It was all the fault of the West again. So the narrative wasn't disturbed by Charlie Hebdo, but it was disturbed by the massacre at the kosher supermarket. And people couldn't deal with this. So it was reported, the massacre at the kosher supermarket was reported. It had to be reported because it was the same day. In Britain, virtually nobody reported the attack on the school. You could say, well, no one died in the attack on the school, but in my view, it's quite significant. 2 attacks on Jewish targets. That actually should tell you something that's going on. And in the view of many French Jews, and I think they're absolutely correct, the only reason that the murders at the kosher supermarket were reported to the extent that they were was because they were on the coattails of Charlie Hebdo. If the murders had taken place only at the Hyper Caché supermarket, it would have caused virtually not a ripple. And we know that to be true because for the previous, whatever it was, 10 years, the French Jews have been under murderous attack. And nobody in Britain has paid the slightest attention. No one. I don't think anyone reported in Britain, perhaps they did, but so low key that I don't remember, the abduction, torture and murder of Halimi, the Jewish boy who was murdered. No one has reported I mean, they report the sort of big atrocities, you know, but very little. And nobody is sort of saying, you know, taking to the street saying, je suis juif, in the way they say, je suis Charlie. No one takes much notice. And the reason, in my view, is because it gets in the way of the story. You can't have Jews as victims. We all know that the Muslims are the victims. So it's like Jewish victims become kind of invisible, both in the diaspora and in Israel. Now, as I was saying, I don't think this is simply a threat to Jews. It's the principal driver of the Islamist onslaught against the West. From the founder of modern radical Islamism, Sayyid Qutb, through the writings of Osama bin Laden to the Hamas Charter, Islamists contend that the Jews have created the evils to be eradicated: America, modernity, and the West. And yet, completely paralyzed by their phobia about Islamophobia, hung up by their obsession with Palestine, and twisted by Holocaust guilt into a profound reluctance to acknowledge Jewish victimization, Britain and Europe continue to fail to grasp that the fate of the Jews, both in Israel and the diaspora, is inextricably bound up with the fate of the West. So, you might think, what about British Jews? That beleaguered minority which can't be considered a minority. What do they think about all this? Surely they are very concerned about Muslim anti-Semitism. No. What do British Jews, in terms of their leadership, I don't talk about the Jew in the pew, the leadership, what do you think the leadership is most concerned to eradicate? Islamophobia. British Jews equate anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I'm talking about the leadership, not talking about the ordinary Jews. The leaders of the British Jewish community say they fight both equally. Why do they say this? Well, there are many reasons. First of all, they are very, very timid. British Jews are always very timid, and with good reason. Their head, heads below the parapet has been the order of the day, basically since Cromwell allowed the Jews back into Britain in the 17th century. 18th century. They're timid. And they're very, very timid to defend Jews robustly, because they believe that by talking about anti-Semitism, you create anti-Semitism. To the Jewish leadership, my crime in Britain, my crime is that I create anti-Semitism. I create it because I talk about it. If I didn't talk about it, there'd be less of it. That's the thinking. Don't upset the Gentiles. Don't insult them, because that just makes them hate us more. That's the order of the day. So there's a reluctance to talk about this at all. The next thing is that there are Jewish practices which are under attack in Britain and in Europe. Shechita and Brit Milah, Jewish ritual slaughter and circumcision. And, Muslims also face a similar problem in terms of their ritual slaughter and their circumcision practices. And so the Jewish leadership has made common cause with Muslims to defend these practices and wants to continue to make common cause. And it thinks that by making common cause, they strengthen their own case. Now, I think for various reasons that is probably wrong, and I think that by associating with Muslim abattoir practices and Muslim circumcision practices, I think that the Jewish leadership is in grave danger of turning Britain against Jewish ritual practices. But put that to one side. That is one very important reason why the Jewish leadership does not wish to talk about Islamophobia, and why it wants to make common cause. So, with its Muslim friends, that we're all fighting the same bigotry together. The bigotry is the same. Now, the third reason, which is perhaps the most important and the most sensitive, is interfaith. Now, the Jewish leadership believes with great faith in interfaith. Interfaith is the way in which we are going to make friends out of our enemies. We will sit down on interfaith committees and, Jews, Christians and Muslims, and we will break down the barriers between us. We will find common ground on which we can agree, where we can share things, we can find things that we think about each other that are wrong, and we will persuade, as Jews, we will persuade the Muslims that the things they've been taught since whenever about the Jews are wrong, because they will see that they're wrong because we'll tell them, and they can see that we're nice people and we extend the hand of friendship, and so on and so on and so on. So this is a terrible mistake because first of all, to keep the show on the road, it's a bit like the peace process. To keep the interfaith show on the road, you can't say anything that's going to upset somebody so badly they're going to walk out. You have to keep talking. So in order to keep talking, you kind of don't talk about anything that's really, really difficult. So that's the first problem, which is a kind of inherent problem. But then there's another problem. I mean, I've had this sort of conversation with rabbis who are involved in interfaith work and who believe in it very sincerely, and I sympathize with their motivation, and I think they are profoundly naive. This is how the conversation with them goes. I will say it's not possible to connect in the way that you think that you are connecting to these people on the interfaith committees, and to which the rabbis say, but we are. I know we are. Because I have made friends out of various imams and Muslim leaders, and I can see the change in their attitude. I can see the things that they've been taught. I can see the veils have been lifted from their eyes, and I can hear. They go on television sometimes and they're saying the things that I've taught them to say. And I say, well, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. And how many people have you met on these committees? And they say, well, 6, 12, 18. And I say, and how many Muslims are there in the world? And I say to them, do you think these Muslim leaders are going back to their communities in Britain saying, guess what, community? You think that the Jews are the spawn of the devil. They're actually really lovely people. Do you think they're saying that? Or do you think they're saying nothing? To which the answer is, well, that's not really my problem. Our whole thing is to make common cause and to find common interests. And I say, but don't you realize where they're coming from theologically? And this is the real key. They say the whole point of interfaith is that we don't get into theology at all, because we couldn't. We start from the premise on interfaith committees that I believe in this kind of stuff and he believes in that kind of stuff, and I'm not going to try and convert him, and he's not going to try and convert me. We'll leave that to one side because we'll never agree. And instead, we're going to concentrate on the stuff where we can agree. That's fantastic, isn't it? Heartwarming. And very sensible from a certain premise, which is that you're all on the same page, rationally speaking, that you're dealing with rational people who want to make common ground because they are prepared to meet you somewhere in the middle. But if you're dealing with a culture and a religion which starts on the premise that you are literally the devil's agents, there's not much room for the common ground. And the people who think there is are being used as patsies. They are being played for suckers. And that's exactly what the Jewish religious leaders and lay leaders who are in all this interfaith stuff are doing. But it drives everything before it. You can't speak against interfaith because then you become a really bad person, because then you're into promoting conflict instead of dialogue, and who wants to do that? So you can see how from a false premise you have an infrastructure which has been set up in the Jewish community leadership in Britain, and for all I know it's the same here, I just don't know about here, which not only doesn't confront these terrible issues, but actually act as a kind of sanitizing mechanism for the prejudice and bigotry in the Muslim world to continue, with a kind of official stamp of approval. Look, I have Jewish friends. How dangerous is this? It's lethal. So this is why in Britain we have, the equation of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. This is why our chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, went, I think it was last year, November last year, he went to, I've forgotten quite where he went. He went to see the Syrian refugees in Greece, somewhere like that. And listen to this. This is from the Jewish Chronicle. Quote, "The chief rabbi and his party had been told it was wise to dress down in the camp. In the bus, they put on baseball caps to hide their kippot. Now just think about that for a minute. The kind of people they were seeing in the refugee camps were the kind of people who, faced with a kippah, wouldn't have been totally thrilled, to put it no more than that. Okay? Now, read on. Having put on his baseball cap to hide his kippah, Rabbi Mervis said he could not help but draw comparisons to, quote, what as Jewish people we have seen before. He said, quote, I have been thinking about our past, our Jewish past and journey, and thinking about our sadness. Here, being taken into a tent where people are resting, I've been thinking about bunkers in Auschwitz, where there was a very different end. Thankfully, these people will have a happy end waiting for them. It will be of promise and hope. He added, standing here alongside these refugees, I'm enormously proud of the British Jewish community and the fact that we want to give. We are not asking questions. What is important is that they are humans, just like we are. They have babies, just like we do. And I'm proud of the way we have reached out to them. Speaking to refugees has made me see the trauma people face could be eased if Europe would sufficiently invest in the hundreds of thousands who are in need. Now, given that the British government under David Cameron had set Britain's face against the European Union and had restricted the number of refugees to 20,000, who the British would handpick in these camps to make sure that no jihadists came flooding into Britain, can you imagine what the British Prime Minister felt when he heard and saw the British Chief Rabbi saying this? I am told that the British government finds the position of the British Jewish community leadership at present in respect of Islamic radicalization coming in through, Islamic radicalization in general, distinctly unhelpful. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine this? The British government, not known for its enthusiasm to deal with anti-Semitism, finds the position of the British Jewish community leadership in respect of the equation between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia unhelpful. This is a truly astonishing situation. So the assumption among many diaspora Jews, especially those on the left, is that anti-Semitism and thuggish political violence are to be found only among neo-Nazis or the far right. It's an article of faith that what is not left is right, what is right is evil, and so all that is not left is evil. That also explains the astounding comment which I personally heard in Jerusalem by Abe Foxman, who recently retired as the head of the Anti-Defamation League, who told a Jerusalem conference that there was no anti-Semitism on the left in Europe, only on the far right. Yeah. I would not have believed it had I said this, had I read this. I heard it. When? It was not a few months before he retired. Because you see, and how does he get to that? How does he get to that view? Because he removes completely the issue of Israel, completely. So the issue of Israel doesn't produce anti-Semitism. You see, it's only the Jews are sucking the blood of Christian children. That's anti-Semitism. That's on the far right. Okay, all right. It's not that common that you hear a leftist saying that. Fine. But by removing the issue of Israel, he was able to confirm himself in his belief that anti-Semitism is a right-wing neo-Nazi phenomenon. And a lot of Jews, diaspora Jews, believe that kind of instinctively to be true because they themselves are on the left. So there can't be anti-Semitism on the left. How can there be? How could they support the left if there was anti-Semitism embedded in the left? They couldn't do it. So it's always the right. So as a result of this mindset, neo-Nazis in Europe, real neo-Nazis, are conflated with democratic nationalists who simply want to stop the mass immigration which threatens the national identities and culture of the nations of Europe and European civilization. These nationalists are also deemed to be fascist. Now this is complicated because some of these groups in Europe are neo-Nazi, they are fascist, but some are not. They're not. They're simply people who don't want Western European culture to be submerged and destroyed. And so the result is a reckless absence of self-preservation by diaspora Jews in seeking to embrace those who would kill Jews or destroy Israel. I would say in conclusion, what I've tried to illustrate to you is that the equation being made between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is false, that it should concern us all, not simply because it denies or sanitizes or covers up or ignores the victimization of Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora, but because it is my absolutely strongly held belief that until and unless the West joins up the dots and understands that anti-Semitism and the attacks on Jews in Europe and on Jews in Israel is not just some outbreak of a horrible prejudice that people thought was dead and buried in 1945 with the defeat of the Nazis in Europe. It is a fundamental aspect of the attack on the West and on Europe. And until and unless the West realizes that anti-Semitism is driving the threat against itself and that the charge of Islamophobia is a way of denying that essential truth, the West will not be able to defend itself properly. It will only defend itself properly when it joins up the dots and realizes that the attack on Jews in Israel and the diaspora is the attack on the West. It's not the canary in the mine, it is the attack. And until that is understood, we will not be able to defend ourselves properly. And I just hope that the press of events, which is changing people's minds, but slowly and in a confused fashion, will enable us to join up the dots in this way.
Well, so then, on behalf of ISGAP and its wonderful audience, thank you.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.